Hello and welcome to the Carlton Academy's Year 10 lesson on how popular the Nazis were. This lesson goes after the lesson on propaganda and terror and how they were both used to help Hitler control Germany. This is the final lesson where we're going to be thinking about control, and our title for today is How Popular Were the Nazis? Now remember, you're going to be making notes on this on paper unless you have got a printer, in which case you can print off the sheets that are on Show My Homework. If you don't have a printer, don't worry, you're not disadvantaged. You just have to do a little bit more note making. Okay, let's make a start. As we've mentioned already on the Teams Live introduction, today we're looking at how popular were the Nazis. The idea is that we're trying to describe different reasons why the Nazis are popular. That would help to get us to grade 3 to 4. We need to be able to explain the different Nazi policies and why these help them stay in power. And to get up to those top grades, we need to be able to make a reasoned judgment about to what extent Nazi popularity was the main reason that they stayed in power. Was it more significant than propaganda or terror, or was it less significant? So if you haven't already, write down that title. Now, it's weird for us to think about in today's society, but the Nazi Party were really popular in Germany in the 1930s. There was an idea that Hitler was the saviour of Germany that ordinary people often believed. Even people who hadn't voted for the Nazis and who didn't like their policies before the 1930s were one around.
Before Hitler, Germany had been deep in economic depression. Before Hitler, unemployment had stood at 7 million. Before Hitler, Germany was a democracy, but too many parties had split the vote, so governments were weak and unable to solve the crisis. Hitler offered dictatorship, all power in the hands of one man. And Germany was quick to accept Hitler's terms.
Unemployment's absurd. People say we are civilized, and yet millions of people are out of work. What is that? That's sick. No one should be denied the right to work. And neither should anyone who can work be allowed to be lazy.
Work and bread. These are the Führer's blessings.
Putting Germany back to work was Hitler's first and most pressing problem. But because he was all-powerful, he had the clout to carry out large-scale work programs, like building autobahns, motorways to link the nation together. By 1935, unemployment had fallen to just 2 million. By 1939, it was gone.
My landlord, Eric, worked for the German Labor Front. He had business all around Germany, and once I went with him to see what they had achieved. And it was remarkable. We saw labor camps, not for wage earners, but for young people, 18, 19 years old, to teach them the value of work, to get their hands hardened. You saw them marching along with their spades like guns, or singing as they dug ditches, reclaimed land. If you spoke to them, sometimes you felt they resented being there, but not often. There was, I think, a pleasure involved. Eric would say,
"You must understand, work shouldn't be just earning a wage and going home. That's drudgery. We believe there's a beauty in labor. You do a job well, and it gives you happiness."
It was like the Nazis were shaking people into feeling good about what they did. You had to work. You had no choice. You were organized. You were there for the state to use, and they would milk you for your labor, no question. But then, at the end of the day, they said, "Now, see what we have achieved." And it was pretty impressive.
The work program was vast and triumphal. Hitler had promised a Germany reborn. He said he was building for a state to last for 1,000 years. He'd rebuild Berlin on a magnificent scale. There'd be an assembly hall in every city, a swimming bath in every village, a house and garden and car for every worker. Much of this was pure fantasy, but enough was achieved to pump German pride.
We're seeing a bit of an introduction to what made the Nazis so popular with the German people. Now we're going to be building on that using the information that is on this sheet. If you have a printer, you can print this off and you can be highlighting as we talk through it. If you don't have a printer, don't worry. What I want you to do is make some bullet pointed notes on what I'm saying over the next few slides. The idea is that you do this either as a spider diagram or as subheadings with bullet points underneath. It's up to you, but there's going to be 3 slides of information that I'm going to talk to you about in the future. Now, just before we begin, I just want to introduce you to it by saying that Hitler was very personally popular. We've seen that in that video clip, and we can see that in the image that we see here at the bottom of Hitler holding hands with lots of different supporters. Now, Goebbels, who was in charge of propaganda, saw the Hitler myth as being the most important part of propaganda and his greatest achievement. Hitler was seen as the saviour of Germany, and that is one of the reasons that he was so popular. He was also seen as being a politician that actually stood by what he said, and we're going to look at his election promises in a second to see how true that was. Let's look now at 3 of the Nazi election promises. They're very much linked, but I still want you to know these 3 separate points. Okay, first of all, the Nazis knew that the democratic governments hadn't been very popular. The Weimar Republic had been built on these shaky foundations, with their very first action being signing the armistice to end the First World War. They hadn't been very liked for a long time because of things like hyperinflation. Remember that people don't get their life savings back. Some of them lose that in 1923 and they never financially recover. Hitler promised that he was going to be incredibly different to what people saw as the weak Weimar governments. He said he was going to act decisively to try and end their problems and build a better Germany. So linked to that is number 3, and the idea that he was going to make Germany strong again. He made this promise and said that he was going to end economic problems, but he was also going to change their foreign policy completely. Now remember that the German people all hated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Whether they were left-wing supporters or right-wing supporters, they all hated it, and they hated the fact that it made Germany so weak. Hitler said that he was going to be the complete opposite of the November criminals who had signed the Treaty of Versailles. Remember that he could appeal to them as a German soldier. Remember that he'd won the Iron Cross in the First World War. And he promised that he was going to break those terms of the Treaty of Versailles, that he was going to end reparation payments, that he was going to take back German land like West Prussia that had been given to Poland. All of this made him really popular with the people, and they felt that he was going to act strongly enough to actually do it. Linked to this is also the idea that he was going to act strongly when it came to the economic problems they were facing. Obviously, from 1929, we have the Great Depression. There were 6 million people that were unemployed and about another 2 million people that were kind of unofficially unemployed that weren't actually claiming unemployed benefits. Hitler promised that he was going to give them work and bread, unlike the Weimar government, who remember had to cut unemployment pay because they couldn't afford to pay those 6 million people those weekly or monthly payments. Remember that there's lots of propaganda that they publish, especially in 1932, and we've got 2 of the posters here. One of them suggesting the Nazis are going to give work and bread, and this one here at the bottom says, "Our last hope, Hitler." And it has lots of pictures of desperate-looking people looking to Hitler for help. The Nazis made these election promises. I'd like you to pause the video here and make some notes if you haven't got a printer. If you have got a printer, you'll be highlighting. You might even want to add some extra points based on what I've been saying. And on the next slide, we'll look at, did the Nazis actually deliver on these really broad election promises? So we've seen what they promised the people. We're now going to be thinking about, did the Nazis actually deliver on these promises that they'd made in the election campaigns of 1930 and 1932? So first of all, thinking about reducing unemployment, remember that they'd promised work and bread. Now, the Nazis were really going to be judged on this because this had been the main platform for their election campaigns. And they did claim that they had won what they called the Battle for Work by 1936. Now, as we know from when we learnt about the workers, they did achieve a lot when it came to creating jobs. Remember, they created loads of jobs in the armaments industry. By 1939, they had 1.4 million people in the army, and therefore they'd created an extra 1.3 million jobs. But also don't forget that they had to create factories to create weapons and uniforms and all the other things that soldiers needed. So they had given a real boost to the economy through these jobs in the army. But they'd also achieved it by doing really unfair things, like first of all, sacking women. As we're going to see next lesson, they wanted women to work in the home and they didn't want them to have actual jobs. So lots of women were sacked and then those jobs were given to men. The same happened to innocent Jewish people, men and women who lost their jobs as a result of them giving them to the Aryan people, the people that they saw as the rightful people of Germany. We'll look more at the Holocaust in the next few weeks and the atrocious actions of this horrendous regime. So first of all, if we're thinking about their first promise of work and bread, we can say that they achieved this to an extent. They cheated a bit by taking away the jobs of women and Jews, and there was over 1.5 million people that were invisibly unemployed, but they did do a lot to give work and bread to the people that they saw as the pure Germans. If we're thinking about their next promise of them destroying the Treaty of Versailles, they did deliver on those promises to a certain extent. I mean, think back to what you learnt about in Year 9. We know from 1933 that they had been secretly rearming Germany. By 1935, they're holding big military rallies where they're parading around their tanks and their soldiers. Remember, they weren't even supposed to have a single tank. So this shows that Germany is really breaking those terms of the Treaty of Versailles. In 1936, they had remilitarised the Rhineland, the area that was next to the border with France. And they'd also begun to recover some lost territory. I mean, think about, for instance, in 1939, they are doing things like invading Poland. In 1938, there's the Anschluss with Austria. So they haven't completely destroyed the Treaty of Versailles, but the German people were really happy with that foreign policy, and they felt that Hitler was actually being this really strong politician, in contrast to their weak governments who had stuck to those terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So generally, they were really popular with the public. We're thinking about here people that benefited from the regime. Obviously, if you were a career-minded woman, you wouldn't have liked what they were doing. Obviously, if you were somebody that they were unfairly discriminating against, for instance, you were disabled or you're Jewish, you wouldn't have liked what their policies were. But generally, the public liked it, and people were willing to turn a blind eye to the horrors of things like the Holocaust as a result of the fact that they had benefited from Nazi policies. Not only do they put in place these policies that benefit people, but they maximise their potential with propaganda. They use it constantly to promote the Nazis and what they're doing. And they also use censorship to make sure that anything negative that they're doing isn't public. Remember, they make newspapers, for instance, censor themselves and only say positive things. So this means that people don't know about the failures and it helps increase their popularity. So I'd like you to pause the video here and make some notes about, did the Nazis deliver on their promises? This next area that we're going to look at is the advantages of being a Nazi. We've seen about the fact that they have delivered on a lot of their election promises. Now let's think generally about, why did it benefit you to join the Nazi Party and how much did it really benefit ordinary people? Now, the Nazi state, there was an expectation that you joined the party. You didn't have to, but it would certainly help you out in society. And there were many different advantages of joining the party. For instance, if you're an official member of the Nazi Party, you would get a better job, better houses, and special privileges. If you owned a business, it would be a very wise idea indeed to be a member of the party, because that way you could get the really large-scale government orders. So ordinary people might not have been supportive of them wholly and all their policies, but they might have decided to do this anyway because it benefited them to some extent. Now, when we think of the Nazi state, we think quite rightly of the horrors of it, the unfair treatment, the brutal policies towards innocent people, and the horrors of things like the Holocaust that we've mentioned already. But for ordinary German people, they didn't see the horrors that we think of when we think of the Nazi state. They think of the benefits that were brought to them at that time. So ordinary people, if you were somebody that was politically reliable, you were politically loyal, you were a supporter of the Nazi Party, and if you were somebody that racially conformed to their ideal person, somebody that was Aryan, somebody that was supposed to be seen as, you know, historically German, and that your ancestors would have come from that area of Germany, there was a lot of benefits that would have been brought in for you. We can see in this picture here the Volkswagen scheme that they had. Now remember, at this time it was a really rare thing for a family, especially a middle class or working class family, to own a car. But the Nazis did things through the Strength Through Joy movement, like saying if you gave a small amount of money each month, soon after you would be able to buy a car because the Nazis would subsidise it and they would pay some money to it as well. Well, they never actually gave out a single Volkswagen car, because when the war came, they said that they couldn't afford to do that. And if you demanded it, they would have said that that was very anti-German of you, and that would have got you in a lot of trouble. So there was a lot of promises, and there was a lot of ideas of, for instance, free holidays. Not everybody actually managed to achieve those kind of things. But the idea is these movements, this Strength Through Joy organisation, makes the people of Germany feel valued. It makes them feel as if the Nazi Party want to reward them and care about them personally. So don't forget things like the Strength Through Joy movement. It's a really important part of our learning. And if you want to know more about it, you can go back to your notes on the workers, because that's where we talked about it first of all. So remember, this was doing things like free holidays, apparently discounted cars, things like free theatre trips, all of this to make the workers feel valued. Now, this last point here at the bottom is arguably the most important bit of this slide. We have to remember that life did get better under the Nazis for people that were seen as loyal and racially what the Nazis wanted. There were more jobs. We've talked about the fact that they reduced unemployment. There was also no crime, because if you committed a crime, you would end up in a concentration camp. That was a great deterrent from causing crimes at that point. There was also the foreign policy successes that we mentioned, about them doing things like rearming, remilitarising the Rhineland, getting back Austria, and doing things like invading places like the Sudetenland and the rest of Czechoslovakia. But more importantly than all of that is the idea of a feeling of unity. Germany had been so divided for such a long time since the First World War. Remember that there had been these big clashes between the left wing and the right wing. Remember, there's Germans killing Germans. For instance, the Spartacus uprising, the left-wing communists are crushed by the right-wing Freikorps. So before, there had been this real divide in Germany, and now the people of Germany felt that there was this feeling of unity. They were working together for the good of Germany, and the power of that cannot be underestimated. So I'd like you to pause the video here and make some notes about the advantages of people joining the Nazi Party and how they benefited from their policies. So you've now got all the basic notes that you need for how the Nazis stayed in power for those 12 years. You've got notes about terror from a couple of lessons ago. You've got notes about propaganda and culture from last lesson. And now you've got some notes about popularity. Now, all of those notes are really important in helping us get to those grade 9s. But now we need to do the hard thinking that helps consolidate our understanding and get us to those top grades. If you were asked to write about this in an exam, they wouldn't just want to know the details of it. They'd want to know the explanation of how does that help the Nazis stay in power. So what I'd like you to do is to think carefully about these questions and record your answers on some paper. Or if you've got the printed sheets, there are some boxes that you can write this in instead. And I'd like you to make sure you're really thinking about this. Don't just skip on to the next slide. Really think about it, because it's helping to consolidate the information. So first of all, I want you to think about today's learning and think about why would being popular help the Nazis stay in power. So try and explain your answer in a paragraph using information from today's lesson. Once you've done that one, I then want you to do the same thing, but thinking about propaganda and culture from last lesson. Why would propaganda, censorship and culture help the Nazis remain in power? And then finally, go back to a few lessons ago and think about terror. Why would terror help the Nazis to remain in power? So pause the video here and make sure you're thinking really carefully about these questions and think about why would this allow the Nazis to stay in power. You've already done a lot of the hard thinking about each of those areas and why they would help the Nazis stay in control. Now what I want you to do is make a reasoned judgment. This is really important for those grades 7 to 9s, and this would be essentially a conclusion in a 12-mark question. So I want you to think about those 3 methods that you've looked at: terror, propaganda, popularity, and which one you think was the most effective method of control. Now, they all played a role in helping the Nazis stay in power, but which one was the most significant, the most effective method? I'd like you to write down your thoughts on your paper so that you've got it for the future and you can revise from it. But I also really want you to send me a brief comment on Teams with what you think and why. This is really important that you're engaging with your teacher live in the lesson, because we would be asking you about this face to face, and we really want to see your ideas. But also, if you're struggling, then we can talk to you about what evidence you can use to support your arguments. So you can't be wrong here. Pause the video and think, which one do you think was the most effective method of control? Off you go. Well done for getting to the end of the lesson. Just a reminder, if you haven't already, it's really important that you send your teacher the most effective method control on Teams. This allows us to have a bit of interaction, and it's a really important feature of the lesson. If you prefer, what you could do as well, if you've done a really good paragraph, is you could take a picture of your last task, and then you could attach it to Show My Homework, where we have put the Teams link. We'd love to see your work, and well done for getting to the end.